my channel. My name is Sandra Gutierrez and I am the face behind Nomad Stitches. This video is part of a series on special crochet techniques. So these are techniques to take your skills to the next level. Although this one is actually quite basic and a lot of people forget about it. So today we're going to discuss all about gauge and swatching. Over the last few weeks, I've been getting quite a few emails asking me about swatching in the round and how to measure gauge. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to swatching and how much you should swatch. Should you swatch? So today we are going to go over all of those things and hopefully clarify all of your doubts. And just before we get started, don't forget to follow me on Instagram, subscribe to this channel, and feel free to comment and like this video as well. Okay, so if you don't want to watch the whole thing, that's okay. Today we are going to cover what exactly is gauge, why should I swatch, how to measure gauge, to block or not to block a gauge swatch, and how to swatch in the round. So down in the description, I'm going to put the timestamps for each one of these topics. So if you want to just jump ahead and go to the topic that you are interested in, then just go ahead and go there now. But let's start with what exactly is gauge. Now, gauge is the number of stitches and rows that can fit in a certain space. Usually is 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. That is also 4 inches by 4 inches. So 4 inches and 10 centimeters are not exactly the same, but the difference is very, very slight. So usually in a pattern you will see either 10 by 10 centimeters or 4 by 4 inches. I use centimeters because I'm a big fan of the metric system. So in all of my patterns, you will see 10 by 10 centimeters. However, if you are using 4 by 4 inches, that is okay. It's usually the same amount of space. Now, these rulers are really, really good for measuring your gauge because it gives you a very good visual of how big that square needs to be. So when you look at your work, you know how big your gauge swatch needs to be, and they're super handy. However, you can use anything like a normal ruler or a measuring tape to check your gauge. Now, if you're a designer, your gauge is the cornerstone of every design. Right, now gauge changes every day, changes depending on the yarn, changes depending on the hook that you're using. So you really, really want to check it before you start making any maths and before you start working a whole garment, because the amount of times that I've had to redo something is just so depressing. So you do want to make sure you have your exact gauge before you start on a project. If you are a maker and you're working on someone else's pattern and you have a gauge that they've given you on the pattern, it's important that you meet that number so that your garment turns out the size that the pattern says it should be. So if you want a medium and it measures this many centimeters around the bust, you want it to be that size. Otherwise, if your gauge is wrong, then you might get a large or an extra large. Or like me, that I ended up making like a triple extra large because my gauge was wrong once, and that was very depressing. Now, even if you have the same exact yarn that the designer used to make a pattern and you are using the same size hook or needle that they are using, it doesn't mean that your tension is going to be the same as theirs. So I have a specific tension, right? And when people end up making my patterns, they always go up or down in hook sizes to get the same exact measurements that I got. So that is very, very important to swatch for you to get the right number of stitches in the right number of centimeters or inches. Now, how do you swatch? That is a very important question. Because the gauge comes in 10 by 10 or 4 by 4 inches, a lot of people think that they need to make a 10 by 10 square or a 4 by 4 inch square. Now, that is not how you swatch, because if you make a 4 by 4 inch square or 10 by 10 centimeter square, that fabric will just kind of compact itself and your gauge will not be as accurate as if you make a bigger swatch and measure that square inside your swatch. So let me show you over here. This is a swatch that I've made. And see how much bigger it is than my 10 by 10 centimeter square. So this is about 15 centimeters, maybe a little bit more, by 15 centimeters. So this is how big your swatch should be. If you have a gauge that your pattern gives, my rule of thumb advice is to make it 1.5 times bigger than the gauge provided. So for example, if the gauge says that it's 10 stitches for 10 centimeters, then you want to swatch 15 stitches. If the gauge says that it is 19 stitches for 10 centimeters, you want to swatch maybe around 30. So that will give you a bigger swatch than your actual 10 by 10 square, and you'll be able to measure inside that swatch, and your gauge will be much more accurate than if you made a small square that only reached here. All right, so that is how you swatch. Should you block your swatch or not? Well, that is a difficult question because some yarns and some stitches change a lot depending on blocking or not. For example, this swatch over here grew from about this much all the way to here just by blocking it. And now I have a very accurate view of what the material will look like when I finish a garment using this stitch and this hook and this yarn. However, other materials and other stitches won't stretch so much. For example, I've made this little swatch and I know that this material and this specific stitch just doesn't stretch so much. Okay, that's the nature of mosaic crochet and this yarn in specific. So I really didn't bother blocking this specific swatch because I didn't think it would make much of a difference. So I think it all depends on the material that you're working with, the kind of stitch that you're working with. If you're doing a lot of double crochet and you're going to make a very long garment, for example, that is going to be so heavy that that is going to stretch. And it is very likely that your garment will be much bigger than you would want it to be. So I would definitely recommend blocking that swatch, stretching it out, and making sure you know what it's going to look like finished, not while you're working it. Because even if you're working it and it's a little bit tighter, garments usually stretch quite a bit. So, you know, consider that. If you're using, for example, waistcoat stitch like this one, waistcoat stitch has a very, very little stretch. So you don't need to worry about blocking that one, for example. But double crochet, like I said, half double crochet on a long garment like this one that I have here, you know, it's just double crochet at the bottom. You do want to block that to make sure that you know what it's going to look like when it's finished and when you are wearing it. How do you measure gauge? So let's go back to our little square over here. This is why this kind of ruler is super, super handy, because you don't need to worry about counting your centimeters or your inches. You know that from here to here, this window is what you need to measure. So you simply count your stitches and count your rows. So in the rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows are inside my 10 by 10 square. And stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 stitches. So I have 13 stitches by 7 rows, and that is the gauge that I have for this. If I need 14 stitches instead of 13, then I would go down a hook size so that my stitches are smaller and more of them can fit. If I need less stitches inside my gauge, I will use a bigger hook so that my stitches are bigger and less of them can fit. Now, the other question that I get very often is how to swatch in the round. Like, remember what I told you, that you want to do 1.5 times the amount of stitches that the gauge has, right? So you're going to do that same thing for swatching in the round, which means that instead of doing 1.5 times, you're going to end up doing 3 times, because you're going in a circle and you're going to end up with this kind of tube. Okay, and this is where you will measure your gauge. Now, a lot of people have issues with swatching so much, because imagine if I cut this up and I stretched it out, it would be a very, very large swatch. So you really don't want to spend that much time swatching, and it might be a bit annoying to do all of that work just to see if your numbers are correct. So even though this is the best way to do it, you can also make a smaller swatch like this one, and instead of measuring 10 centimeters, you measure 5 centimeters. So how many stitches can you fit in 5 centimeters? If you can fit, let's say here I can fit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8.5 actually. So I would multiply 8.5 by 2, and that is 17 stitches. So in theory, I should fit 17 stitches in 10 centimeters, because I can fit 8.5 in 5. And the same goes with the rows. How many rows can you fit? This is mosaic crochet, so it's easier to measure on the other side. So in 5 centimeters, I can fit 2, 4, 6, 8, 7, which means that in 10 centimeters, I will be able to fit 14 rows. And that is how you measure gauge in the round. Now, like I said, it's not as accurate if you make a small swatch like this one, but it is a good workaround to not swatch so much. So if you're really not feeling like making a huge swatch, then just make a smaller one and use about 1.5 times the stitches that you would need in the round, and measure only 5 centimeters. So in that example I was telling you earlier, imagine that there are 19 stitches in the gauge in 10 centimeters. So for this small swatch, I would swatch maybe 30 stitches and work them in the round, and it would give me a smaller square where I can measure my 5 centimeters. Like I said, ideally you would swatch 60 stitches instead of 30 and make a bigger swatch where you can fit your square in the middle without any problem. But I understand that's a lot of swatching, so if you want an alternative, measuring a smaller gauge and then multiplying it, making sure that you have the right number of stitches, then that works as well. I think that is all I have for today. So please feel free to ask questions in the comments. I'm happy to answer them. And follow me on Instagram. I am Nomad Stitches. You can find loads of my designs. These are all swatches that I've used in my designs, so I hope you like them. And yeah, I hope you start loving swatching as much as I do, because it can be a lot of fun. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you next time. Bye bye.